Who really holds power in our world today? This is obviously an important question for anyone who wants to make a difference politically, who wants to direct history for the better, presumably. If you want that, you are de facto in competition with existing power structures, with existing people who hold power. And if you don't know who those people are, you don't know what methods they're employing, you don't have a meaningful shot at overcoming their agenda. Now, some people want to theorize about the nature of elite groups using heuristics derived from sociology, political science, economics. And when you do that, you run into a couple really fundamental epistemological problems. The more general is that all social science runs into observer effects, where human beings can be aware of the theories that are out there about human nature, and that will have an impact on human behavior. Like, for example, if Marx's theory of class conflict and revolution would have been true prior to him theorizing, once he generates the theory and publishes it, then existing capitalist elites can see these theoretical dynamics clearly and they can respond to them. Right? Observer effects in sociology are very real, just as a general rule of thumb. And so basically, heuristic simplification and creating models, deterministic models of behavior, doesn't work very well for looking at human behavior because we change, we're dynamic. When you observe human systems, they observe you back and they change their behavior as a result. But that's just a general point. The more specific point with elite groups is that when you go to construct your theories, sociologically, economically, whatever, of the nature of the elite, you are engaged in a field of research that has been filtered through elite institutions, right? You're going to go to mainstream academic journals, you're going to go to mainstream publishers, university presses that exist at the mercy of existing financial powers, right? So they, quote unquote, they don't want to reveal too much about themselves. And so you shouldn't expect to find a model of elite sociology that is going to give you that key detail you need, that kind of key insight into what it would take to overcome them. If elite groups are clever, and obviously they are, they will want to occlude certain facts about the way they do business, where they derive their power, their methods and means. So there's a general observer effect in sociology, in social science generally. Elites don't want you to know about them, and they will actively seek to hide their influence. And so, theorizing from specialized disciplines using heuristic simplification is not really appropriate. To theorize about the nature of the elite, we have to go much broader. And this is one case where, because we're dealing with a finite number of people, the global elite isn't millions of people. We're talking 10,000, 20,000 people who hold power in a meaningful sense. And those are particular historical individuals belonging to particular families, coming from particular institutions, and it's not impossible to trace all of those historical details. So I think that kind of approach to analyzing the elite is going to be a lot more reliable. Of course, there you run into the same problem, where when you want to read histories about the nature of the elites, they will have authorized many of the histories that you can find. And it'll take a lot of digging to find unauthorized histories of elite social classes. So not only do we have to consult particular historical institutions, the facts on the ground of history, we also have to look kind of as far and wide as we can and look for clues in unexpected places. And there's not going to be like hard and fast rules for this kind of elite theorizing, which kind of brings us into the territory of conspiracy theory generally. Obviously, the world has always been moved forward by conspiracies. People don't do anything just operating in isolation. People achieve things by getting together in a group and conspiring towards certain ends. And often it's better for you to keep your conspiracy secret. Right? There are plenty of examples of secret societies, esoteric conspiracies that have shaped the direction of history. Okay. Now, maybe my approach to this is too simplistic, and I'm not properly identifying who the elites really are. But I look to particular institutions like the Federal Reserve Bank, like, the Rothschild banking dynasty, the emergence of fractional reserve banking in general, central banks, the Bank of England, these sorts of things. And I look at the way those institutions are structured, the kind of financial leverage these sorts of institutions afford, and I conclude that whoever started these institutions, whoever owns these institutions, and like the Federal Reserve is a semi-private entity that has private shareholders who profit from the activities of the Fed. A lot of those people, we don't know exactly who they are. So whoever is connected to that, whoever benefits from the Federal Reserve, from central banks around the world, from fractional reserve banking in general, those people, I would say, are the relevant elites in the world. They're obviously not the only influential people. There are also influential media figures, scientists, technocrats, politicians. But the thing is that if you have an unlimited font of liquidity, which is what central banking and fractional reserve banking gives you, I think it would be hard to argue against that. And if you're not aware of why, it's because new money is created as debt. That debt has interest on it. So further new money has to be created, again, as debt to pay off that old debt. And so just constantly a system of debt slavery is kind of ensured by the nature of fractional reserve banking. So given that, I say that these people who have this unlimited font of liquidity are able to bribe, employ, and in general farm out intellectual work to these competing elite groups, a managerial class, a technocratic class, a scientific class, media personalities, political figures. All of these people can be bought. Realistically, they're individuals with private interests. And if you have already been in power for centuries, you control elite institutions, then aspiring elites in any of these other categories outside of finance are kind of going to have to bend the knee to whatever ethos is enforced in elite institutions, elite universities, elite think tanks, elite research agencies. Just imagine what you could do if you had the resources that international finance has at its disposal. It has trillions of dollars that it has the ability to hide as well. Finance gives you a lot of mechanisms that are very occult. People don't know about these esoteric financial mechanisms that the banking class does. So you have a bunch of exotic technologies for hiding wealth and, putting resources in different places all around the world. What could you do if you're an intelligent actor with interests in the world, with political agendas? Like, think of what you could do if you had just $1 trillion and the ability to hide that. You could set up independent research agencies that operate on a basis of compartmentalization, where the people you're hiring don't even know what the big picture is, but you are compiling all of these pieces that you need, you could basically achieve whatever you want, given a long enough time. You could set up a whole parallel economy, whole secret societies, not in the sense of like the Masons or something like that, but, you know, off the books, um, you know, whole economic processes. So I think it just requires a little bit of imagination. We have to look at the way that finance centralizes wealth, the ability of financiers to hide that wealth, their ability to recruit managerial elites, technocratic, scientific elites, political elites, their ability to control these major institutions, uh, and what they could, in principle, do with that. Now, if you want to assume incompetence on the behalf of these elites, then you're free to do that, but I think that's an irresponsible move. I don't know why you would assume that they're less intelligent than you are. Like, you might be high IQ, but you're not that special. Especially if you are relying on your kind of gut hunches about what is important politically. Like at the outset, this whole discussion is predicated on the idea that you want to shape history in some particular way. But why do you want to shape history in that way? Most people, their vision of what they want the world to look like is based on intuitions. You know, people go for nationalism, where they have these intuitions about what is good for my people, how should the demography of my nation look, these sorts of concerns. Or people go for feelings of fairness and equality, and they have this gut hunch intuition. Like proto-communist movements have existed perennially, you know, throughout history. So there are these instincts that people have, you know, for fairness, for equality. And the elite group has funded research into nationalist movements. You know, they've made case studies, they've created fake nationalist ops, they've created fake far left ops. Like, they understand you, they know your type. You might have a high IQ, you're not that special. They've seen your type, they know who you are. So especially if you operate on instinct, you're predictable to them, you're transparent to them, they're a cult to you, and you don't understand their motives or their objectives. I think many people project onto the elite group kind of ethnocentrism and motives that they can identify with. And no doubt that plays a part. But if you're an elite group, like the incentive towards nationalist sentiments, ethnocentrism, is not as high as it is if you're a middle class guy, like a normal person tied to the land, so to speak. You know, middle class people are put in the middle of the consequences of what's going on in their immediate community. So like demography matters. Who is in your community really matters, and that's going to influence who, you know, your children marry. Like, just who's around. Human beings are kind of predictable in that way. If people are mingling, there's going to be, that's just the direction of things, right? So if you want control over your genetic stock, over the direction of your evolution, which is, as biological creatures, what we want, right? A lot of why we seek wealth, why we seek social status, is to have exclusive privileges as to reproductive decisions. So as a middle class person, that ethnocentrism makes a lot of sense. It gives you more control over your breeding stock. Elite groups have all sorts of institutions to mediate that reproductive process. So there are filters between the daughters of the elite and prospective suitors, and they can easily recruit people from different societies without risking what ethnocentric people are concerned about, often with like a disintegration of the nature of the genetic stock that they have access to. I hope you understand. I have to speak indirectly here. So it's not as important for elites, and it's, you know, hard for us to identify with the kinds of concerns that they have. Now, I think that is confounded also, our ability to read into their motives, by their worldview, where they are not base materialists. Clearly, they have acted to pump out mainstream scientism. That's the predominant worldview. A lot of people go for that. I'd say, even in the US, at this stage, that force ideologically is more powerful than Christianity on the whole. Just base materialist sciencism. And the elites push that out. They don't subscribe to this, as far as I can understand. If you look into their connections, into their occult practices, they have more of a perennialist worldview, and that means that their concepts of what is truly valuable will be at a much larger scale than we're used to thinking about. Many of them do believe in things like reincarnation. And, we don't have institutions, research institutions that, have conducted all the research that you could do on these sorts of occult things that are suggested by the ontology of perennialism, by the metaphysics of perennialism, right? We don't really research reincarnation. We don't really research psi abilities. We don't look into these sorts of things. And it's very difficult to get funding to look into these sorts of things. So tie that back to the idea that the elites want to occlude the tools that are vital for their maintenance of power. So, it's natural that we write off things like telekinesis, telepathy, reincarnation, a whole set of things that perhaps uh, key members of elite groups are very well aware of, have conducted research on, and that's where their value judgments are, situated. That's where they're thinking of these questions of larger purpose. And so it's going to be hard to predict their behavior if you're not making these sorts of value judgments in the same way that they are, if you're not aware of these same dynamics that they are. Of course, I think that metaphysics is correct. I think that's the ancient metaphysics going back thousands of years. I think it is just the true nature of reality, and I could, justify that in a number of different ways, pointing to the philosophers who have gotten closest to it. But in any case, I think that you can't really combat them unless you are tying your ethics and your politics down to a metaphysics that is as fundamental as theirs. Now, that being said, I don't think that they have ultimately hit on the truth. And the reason for that is that, when these banking technologies emerged, the people who would become the global elite, the genetic clusters involved, were making contracts, were like viewing financial contracts in terms of legitimating authorities that were higher than themselves. If they made contact with such spirits, and this kind of theurgy is possible, then those spirits ultimately are the powers in charge of our world. So, who ultimately holds power in our world? I think the Bible is right in that it is Satan, it is Mammon, it is some, you could call it an egregore spirit that seeks to appropriate and parasite off of the work of ordinary beings. That's what I think. And I think that the existing elite are those who have gotten closest to the center of power here, who are kind of the toadies of Satan. That's what I believe, and I'm not going to justify that. And I could go on a bunch of rabbit trails trying to talk about why I think this or that. I'm just giving my basic take. This is what I think has happened. And I therefore think they haven't quite gotten to the truth. They've gotten a lot of the mechanics right about the metaphysics of perennialism. They understand reincarnation. Maybe many of them have learned how to access past life memories. They understand psi abilities. They understand remote influence in various ways. And they use all of these things. But maybe they haven't taken some conclusions all the way, as far as they would need to realize like genuine perennialist ethical principles. People often talk about the division between a left-hand path and a right-hand path in perennialism. Left-hand path is like this kind of Sabbatai Zevi logic. Obviously, that's Judaism, strictly speaking, but it's kind of the same basic move, saying that we can kind of liberate ourselves from law by violating law, and therefore kind of get closer to the principle of things, which is not particularistic. So, in general, perennialism asks us to move from the particular to the one, right? In some sense, to the undifferentiated, to the source of things. And the left-hand path tells you you can achieve that by ignoring particular responsibilities that you have, ignoring particular ethical norms that you should be subject to, given your historical role, and ignore all of those particularities and just move into this pure agential identification with the will, right? You are an embodiment of will, and do as thou wilt will be the whole of the law, like Aleister Crowley kind of stuff. This, I think, is the direction the elites have gone. And I think that's from a misunderstanding, and they don't understand ultimately what is going to be the consequence, right? When Satan is incarnated, and I do think that is ultimately the game plan. I think that's what the Bible tells us as well. There will be the beast system. There will be the Antichrist. We are incorporating AI into these corporate hive minds, as I talked about recently in another video. We're building these cybernetic, behemoth, cyborg things, and the goal there is to be able to host the satanic principle. Now, what is the principle of evil? According to Proclus, there is no arche, like strictly speaking. There is no principle archetype of evil, because evil is essentially legion. But nevertheless, there is a kind of asymptotic approach to a path that, is a bad path, and it's not one that we should be following, but it's there. It is there as an option, and it's there for a reason, and that is a path of parasitism. Evil is not pure negation. It's not purely privatio boni that Proclus comes to. In some sense, that's true, because there's no substance of evil. There's no arche of evil. And so any apparent evil is a result of a kind of lack of context of the whole, not understanding the whole. But on top of that, there is the ability to repurpose the energies of good beings for private gain, selfish purposes. And there is a kind of teleological justification for that. If you believe that a good God would create the best of all possible worlds, then there will be a purpose for evil. And that purpose for Proclus is that when parasitism occurs, some genuine good is created. Like when we harvest plants and eat them with our family, that we are, in a sense, parasitizing off of these other living organisms. But we benefit in some way. So it's not purely harm. So parasitism brings about some good that wouldn't otherwise exist. And if you want all goods the maximum good to exist, the goods that come from parasitism should exist as well. But then the harms that come with that will have to, in some sense, be illusory. And that's the move that Proclus takes. And if you believe that, we are here in the world of generation due to a fall, this is all perennialist, Platonist positions. If we're here due to some sin, some fall that we have undergone, then experiencing harm from parasitical beings actually could be a way of correcting our soul and bringing us back to a better state of mind and, reconnecting us with benevolent higher beings. So there's a purpose to evil. That's a kind of tangent from the main point, but in any case, that is this satanic influence. It's parasitical. That's what it does. Satan is this parasite off of God's creation who wants to appropriate and take for himself and concentrate into himself. And I think that's what will be incarnated. That's what we're in the process of incarnating. Dehumanized systems that are way beyond our comprehension and elite actors are supporting their creation. A lot of them believe in this transhumanist cult, thinking that they can be uploaded into the AI cyborg hive mind or whatever, and they'll be immortal. I think all of that is ill-founded hope, and they are being tricked by Satan. That's what I really believe. And to combat that, you have to understand this metaphysical framework. The battle is spiritual. The battle is against powers and principalities. And, those are ranks of angels, higher spiritual beings that are not corporeally present on our plane. So I think if you want to know the nature of the elites, you have to understand the cosmology they're working with, a lot of them. You have to understand the roots of their power structure, the ethnic roots, the religious roots, the myths these people believe in, to infer the nature of their value structure, to do something to combat their influence. You have to at least have access to the same tools they do. And if they're using remote influence, psychic technologies, sigil magic, these sorts of things, and that's well documented. I mean, if you watch enough YouTube videos and go down enough rabbit trails, all of this stuff will be familiar to you. I'm not making this up. I'm also not going to be exhaustive in like citing sources and stuff. Like I said, you have to go very broad if you want to theorize about the nature of the elites, and it takes like a lifetime of observing carefully a bunch of different data points. For example, one data point that I have looked to many times is the nature of archaeology as a discipline. Why is it so conservative? Why are there so many suspicious gaps in the archaeological record? For example, we have genetic data on Gravettian groups. That's an ancient European Upper Paleolithic culture. Aurignacian groups even. We have Magdalenian DNA. We have DNA from a bunch of different places. Japan from the Upper Paleolithic. Two key cultures that would be relevant if the Atlantis story was true, as told by Plato, are missing. We don't have Solutrean DNA, and we don't have Clovis DNA. Absolutely zero. A ton of sites, no DNA. Archaeology is a tightly controlled discipline. It is very conservative. If you want to explore something that's radical, you're not going to get funding. They're not going to fund your expedition. It takes a lot of money to do. And if you want something tested, you're going to have to get approval there are long lines to have things tested in some of these university labs. And if elite actors want something hidden in the ancient past, it's not that hard to do. If you look at the early Neolithic even, there are a ton of dams that have been constructed that flooded early Neolithic sites. Probably one of the most important is not that far from Göbekli Tepe. A lot of people know about Göbekli Tepe, but they don't know about, and the pronunciation I know will be wrong here, but I think it's like Cheinu, which is in some ways more impressive than Göbekli Tepe. Massive cult complex, advanced statues. To my mind, it looks like, where the Göbekli Tepe ruling caste lived. And yeah, when I look at like mainstream academic treatments of the Neolithic, they always want to talk about it in these abstract terms, broad diffusion of technological packages. But what I see is all of a sudden a really advanced group showed up and started directing things, and built out the structure of civilization as we know it, including all those banking technologies that emerged later, like the existence of ruling elites around the world derives from this ruling class that showed up suddenly in southeast Anatolia around 10,000 BC. And a lot of Neolithic sites have been flooded. A lot of stuff is being covered up. You have to do a lot of digging. Another interesting fact, like it's very difficult to get information about archaeology that's gone on in the Azores Islands. Those islands are where I think Atlantis would have been. This is very esoteric stuff, but that's where I think they would have been. Portugal owns those islands, and Portugal was one of the earliest colonial powers, kept its colonial empire the longest, would be one of those powers that's connected to the global elite. Historically, probably the ruling powers in Portugal are still connected to said global elite. So I think that the means, methods, motive, opportunity to cover up ancient history is there, and they have done that. And covering up recent history often is like they're remarkably good at it. And a lot of you guys, I'm sure, understand the kinds of things that I'm talking about there. I think they're very sophisticated in their approach. I think they use occult practices. I think we should not underestimate them. And I think basically you can't combat them at all unless you get to a deeper fundamental philosophy than they have, unless you get on their level there. Like if you, for example, are just interested in politics, a lot of people will become Catholic, even though they're not truly pious. They don't really care about devotion to Christ. They want like a coherent metaphysics that they can use to justify their ethical and therefore political prescriptions. And then they go on to try to like argue politically. That's not sufficient. That's not how the elites operate. It's not just like dogmas that they're adhering to. They believe in philosophical methods, scientific methods, and their system is just more robust than any exoteric dogmas of any existing faith. Also, mainstream religion as it exists for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, has been one of their primary vehicles of control. I really don't get people who like completely dismiss this hypothesis of an ancient ruling elite. Once these banking technologies exist, it's just a snowball from there on. Like you will amass wealth. And if you're an international community that has seen the rise and fall of many empires, you're going to beat out local elites. It's not that they've always gotten their way. Like, I think there was very little influence in European history, at least Northern European history, of any of that stuff until 700, 800 AD. I think in a certain way, they had a setback with a lot of the Bronze Age, invasions from the Pontic-Caspian steppe did come as a surprise, right? And there are competing forces in this world, but none as comprehensive and integrated as this global financial elite. They have their secret clubs that they meet up in. We're not talking about millions of people. We're talking about thousands of people. There are only, like, in the official lists, like 2,000 billionaires. 2,000 people can know each other, right? Can coordinate things. They can recognize their common interests. If you want to theorize that they will inevitably be in conflict with one another and they can't collude in their common interest, again, it's like you can't model with simplified heuristics the behavior of intelligent actors because they're intelligent. And if they're as intelligent as you, then any conclusion that you're coming to that you think means that they can't be as significant a threat as you are afraid they might be, they'll be aware of those same predictions and they'll modify their behavior accordingly. It's like anything you want to theorize about the elites to say that it's impossible for them to hold power, they also could be aware of and can respond to. You're not inherently smarter than them or have some special access to knowledge that they don't. In fact, they have access to a lot of knowledge that you don't, not vice versa. They know you, you don't know them. Okay, so, people want to theorize very abstractly about the nature of political elites. It's historical forces, right, that have given a certain class of people enormous influence. They have the tools they need and the motive to control technocratic classes around the world, to control political classes around the world. They have the incentive to mask their activities as best as they can. And since like all of this stuff did originate from groups that were making contact, or they believed they were making contact with higher spirits, if that kind of thing is possible, those spirits may still be involved. Totally unrelated analogy. The Jews, for example, the Hebrews make this pact with this deity that promises to benefit them biologically in kind of basic national terms. They'll be the father of many nations, etc. If that kind of bond was created at an early date, If there is a most powerful parasitical spirit that is vying for control of the world, then the people who made a contract with them would have access to tools that the rest of us might not be conscious of, because you're dealing with superhuman intelligence, very plausibly, very possibly. You don't know the scope of the universe. You don't know what kind of intelligences are out there. You don't know how contact may be made. I have theories about it, and to me, it is a possibility. Of course, if you don't have that basic philosophical foundation, holistic worldview on the level that the elites have, if you fall into elite projected mainstream philosophical naiveties like materialism, like biological reductionism, like all of this kind of stuff, then it'll seem absurd. But if you continue digging and look at the sources that, maybe leak some of the nature of that occult activity, like Plato. Plato famously has been accused through history of leaking the philosophy of the mystery schools. So this wasn't something original to Plato. Obviously, there's Pythagoreanism and Orphism too in the background with Plato, but he was revealing something that in a concealed way, right? It's not like it screams through the dialogues at face value, some of this deeper stuff there. You have to really do some digging. And, according to Neoplatonic commentators, that was common to other Greek philosophers as well. All of the ancient sages understood that certain things should not be disclosed to the masses. You shouldn't cast your pearls before swine. That was a common view. So when we're interpreting Greek sayings, trying to extrapolate what Thales really thought based on a couple sayings, we're not in a good position, because these people believed in an esoteric-exoteric divide. They believed in occluding certain things about their philosophy. But there are leaks that have happened through the centuries. There are clues here and there that you can pick up on, and you can put the pieces together. But if you don't do that because you think that's conspiracy theory, if you only want to get respectable intellectual, academic journal articles together and make some kind of sociological theory, I think you're falling right into their trap. You're going to run into these epistemological limitations of social science, as I said in the beginning. And yeah, they will continue operating in the background as they have for so long. That's what I think about the elite. I think you can't combat them unless you get down to the level that they have, rethink some fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, understand what they're using to acquire power, and tap into similar forces. And none of what I'm saying is that controversial for Christians, or shouldn't be. Maybe in a sense it is, but I'm getting some details, or I'm fleshing out some details that aren't there in the Bible, but it is said that Satan is the ruler of this world at the moment. There will be a beast system, there will be an antichrist, and we will overcome this by joining in the corporate identity of Christ, joining the body of Christ, assimilating ourselves to a higher being, one that is higher than this satanic force. And according to the metaphysics of Platonism, this parasitical hierarchy can never be as powerful as the one itself and as its primary emanations. So if that's the nature of the battle, it's not just like you calculating against some smart person in a bank somewhere. It's not you against them in some chess match. If it's you in some sense against Satan and his lackeys, then you're going to need to appeal to something at a higher level. And how do you do that? That's the question. So it's a different kind of battle if you see the full picture, I believe, than many people suspect. And, nationalist activism, trying to influence mass politics, or for that matter, progressive activism, trying to bring about a fairer, more egalitarian world. These things are pointless. You're falling into traps laid by the enemy, and you're not going to make headway. Not necessarily saying no one should ever do any of that political stuff, mundane political stuff. But if you really want to make a difference, if you want to put yourself up against the elite, then you have to get on their level and you have to think about some things in a deeper sense. So thank you guys for listening. God bless.